Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the TTArtisan 75mm f2 STM lens. Now, earlier this year, I reviewed the first TTArtisan autofocusing lenses, in this case, a 35mm f1.8 and a 56mm f1.8. Both of those lenses were for APS-C. That, of course, brings its own challenges, them moving from doing manual focus only to doing autofocusing lenses. But in this case, they've taken a step forward yet again. And so this is their first full frame lens. This is a lens for either Sony E-mount full frame or Nikon Z-mount full frame. I'm reviewing Sony here today, but I believe that both the Sony E-mount and Z-mount for Nikon will be released at the same time. Not only is this their first full frame lens, this is the first time we have seen an aperture ring on one of their autofocusing lenses. So again, further steps in the right direction. And probably most impressive to me is the fact that this is actually quite a mature, good performing lens that is going to cost significantly under $200, about $180 US. And it is, my conclusion, the best sub $200 telephoto prime lens that I have yet seen to this point. So we're going to dive in detail and help you understand whether or not this is a lens that might work for you. First of all, talk about build, handling, and the features here. This is a lens that continues to be compact. Now, there is an even more compact competitor that I'll get to in just a moment, but this lens is only 65 millimeters in diameter and 73 millimeters in overall length. So that's a little over 2.5 inches by right under 2.9 inches. Now, that is 4 millimeters longer than the Samyang AF 75 millimeter f1.8. I'm actually filming on the moment with the Samyang VAF 75mm T1.9 lens. And so the difference, of course, here, the Samyang just AF lens is $350. The VAF lens that I'm filming on right now is more like $650. So obviously this is very slightly larger, but it's also significantly cheaper. It also is a little bit heavier. This lens is 328 grams or 11.57 ounces, which is nearly 100 grams heavier than the Samyang lens. And the main reason for that is while the Samyang is a plastic fantastic, this lens is actually all made of metal. It feels fairly premium overall in its build. It has a nice anodized black satin finish on it. Everything is very nicely executed here. We do, as mentioned, have an aperture ring for the first time. This is a clicked, there's no declick option, and so it has clicks at the 1/3 stop to tenths. Everything seems to move with good precision, good solid clicks there, and then there is a gap between f16 and then A or automatic mode, which will allow you to control aperture from within the camera. I would like to see a little bit firmer a detent between f16 and automatic mode, but a fairly minor quibble. Overall, aperture ring worked just like I would hope it would. The aperture iris itself is 9 blades, and so it retains a fairly circular shape when stopped down a bit. Not perfect, but overall not bad there. It also comes with a more traditional lens hood. And so those first APS-C lenses, my main critique of them, in some ways the lens hood was nice. It's made of metal. This one's just plastic. But in those early cases, it almost had kind of a letterbox design, like a rectangular opening. And the biggest problem is you couldn't reverse a lens hood like that, nor could you add filters and operate them on the front with the way that it was designed. In this case, we have a more traditional design. It can be reversed for storage. When you put it on, there is sufficient room there to still use filters after you have mounted it. Filter size is actually 62 millimeters, which is not incredibly common, but has become more common in recent years. I've seen a number of lenses that do share that overall filter size. Once again, we have got a lens cap that has a USB-C port and then some electronic contacts in it. So you actually do firmware updates through the lens cap itself. I actually prefer having it mounted on the lens itself, on the lens mount, like Viltrox does it, but at least again, we have the option for doing firmware updates here. Now, one area that's not fantastic about the lens is the minimum focus distance. It's 75 millimeters and the magnification level looks fairly low to me. Probably around 0.10, 0.11 times. The Samyang gives you a better 0.14 times magnification, and it can focus down about 7 centimeters closer. I did feel certainly in situations where I felt like I just couldn't get as close of what I would like, and so I did find it slightly limiting, so that's something that you might want to bear in mind. Overall, however, this is a really nicely executed package, and while it is a little bit bigger and heavier than what the Samyang lens is, the feel of everything here is much higher grade, right down to the manual focus ring, which actually feels quite good. Now, how about autofocus? Autofocus comes via a lead screw type STM focus motor here, and autofocus in general is about averagely good. So as far as the sound itself is very minimal. You can hear some very light whirring, mostly, however, if you're only in an extremely quiet environment and you put your ear closer to it. Otherwise, it's pretty close to being silent in operation. You can see here that autofocus speed is reasonably good, but certainly not instantaneous. And you will see a little micro pulse or step in there periodically. And so it's not flawless in overall performance there, but autofocus speed, particularly when you get outdoors in good light, you can see it's zipping back and forth fairly quickly there. Overall, I also found that it did a good job of staying tracked on the eye, both in the test here, but then also in taking shots of the cats, taking shots in a church type setting of the speaker, doing a quick portrait session with my son on his first day of school. In all of those situations, it nabbed the eye well, it focused accurately, delivered well-focused results. So I really had no complaints in real-world use for autofocus. In fact, my only complaint was that there was occasions where, again, I would bump up against that minimum focus distance. But outside of that, autofocus worked just fine, and I have no issues with it there. Overall, for video work, not bad either. Video focus pulls were quick, but what I did see is there were some visible steps sometimes, some little micro pulses. So it's not perfectly confident, but overall the quickness was fairly good. You will see some fairly obvious focus breathing there, so that's not necessarily a strength for the lens. Neither is the Samyang, by the way. That's an issue for it as well. Now, when I did my hand test, or alternately block the view of the camera of my eye with my hand and then remove it, going back and forth, there was good speed there. There was some pulses. Every now and then, in either situation, you'll see a rack in the wrong direction. So it's not flawless, but there is obviously potential that firmware updates might make that even more well executed. Overall, however, for ordinary shots, I felt like autofocus was stable. I have shot one of my YouTube episodes where I had forgotten to bring along my typical recording camera. I had this with me, and so as a byproduct, it got the job done. It was stable. It did just fine. So overall, autofocus is not top tier good, but again, this is far from being a top tier price. And I've reviewed lenses like a Mic 85mm f1.8 that were infinitely worse than this lens and cost a little bit more. So I think that this is a pretty well executed package overall. How about our image quality here? I'll give you a quick overview of optical performance, and if you want a deeper dive, you can read either the text review or stay tuned for the deep dive optical examination that I'll put at the end of the video. We have an optical design of 10 elements in 7 groups. 5 of those are exotic elements. MTF looks good, but it doesn't look exceptionally good. It definitely trails off towards the edge. But what I found in real-world use is that I think that this lens actually strikes quite a good balance between sharpness and then also having very nice out-of-focus region, very nice bokeh, and I'll get more to that in just a second. The distortion here, there's a bit of pincushion distortion. It needed a -5 to correct, and vignette was very low, only a +32. I suspect it's probably a little heavier on Z-mount. That's been my experience, at least, with these lenses that are both E-mount and Nikon Z-mount. Here on Sony, at least, I don't really feel like you need to correct either one of those things. That little bit of pincushion distortion is actually flattering for portraits because it makes the subject a little bit slimmer looking, and so overall, I'm not too concerned about either one of those things. I also feel like they have done a good job of controlling longitudinal chromatic aberration. In extreme situations, I saw the tiniest bit of fringing, but overall it is so well controlled it's not really a factor at all. Likewise with lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame, they're basically non-existent. So overall, fringing is well handled here. As I took a look at resolution, and this is on a 61 megapixel A7R Mark V, so highest possible at the moment, full frame standard for resolution. Even on that, and looking at results at 200%, I felt like results looked pretty good. I would say real world observations there from my chart test is that the center looked a little bit worse than what I expected from the MTF. Not bad, but a little bit worse than the MTF chart. And I felt like the corners looked better than what the MTF chart suggested. But overall, across the frame, I felt like results were solid. Contrast is not off the charts. But what I did find is that if you stop down to f2.8, contrast really improves. And so you have the ability, if you want that contrast, just stop down to f2.8 and it is certainly there. We're very sharp even into the corners by f4. Thus, as a byproduct, I found that landscape images look really nice. And for example, in this shot of islands, even if we do a deep crop of the little island off to the left, you can see that resolution is still holding up very nicely and the image is still quite beautiful. So there's a lot of potential in resolution to be able to crop deeply into images. Likewise, I also found that diffraction was not bad. You are going to see it after f11, but minimum aperture here is f16. And while it certainly is softer than f11, it's still not terrible. So I don't consider it to be all that big of a deal here. I mentioned that the bokeh is nicer than what I expected. And I found that in just a variety of situations that the bokeh was really quite soft. And that's one of the advantages of not correcting everything and not having incredible contrast wide open, is that it does leave the potential for an often softer, creamier bokeh. And I believe that's the case here. As a result, I think that there's sufficient sharpness to make most people happy. And at the same time, the bokeh rendering is really quite nice. The blend of that, I think, is good. And you can see from these images that I've been showing, overall, I feel like the rendering is really quite nice. Now, a shortcoming for these TTArtisan lenses that hasn't yet gone away is that flare resistance is not flawless. It's improved, but it's not great. And so what you'll find is that straight on, it's not too bad, but if your bright light source gets into the corner of the frame, you tend to get some fairly large ghosting kind of blobs of color there. And so you're just gonna have to watch out for that and to compose accordingly. My conclusion is this. This is a surprisingly complete lens for $180. And I think that TTArtisan has done a great job of finding a nice blend between sharpness and rendering, and a lens that I think is nicely made without being overly heavy or large. Overall, this is just a nice little lens. And considering how low the price tag is, right under 180 US, I mean, it's hard to point too many fingers here when this is just a really well executed package for the price. So overall, I'm quite impressed with this lens and its ability to perform here. And as I mentioned in my intro, I would say that to this point, this is probably the best sub $200 telephoto prime that I've yet seen at this point for full frame. I think it's a great option for someone that maybe only has a kit lens and would like to add a prime lens, or maybe a cheap portrait lens. This is a really compelling little package here, and definitely well worth consideration. You want more information? You can check out my full text review that is linked in the description down below. There's also linkage there to an image gallery and some buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, or if you would prefer to take a deeper dive into the optical performance. Stay tuned with me right now. Let's jump into it. All right, so let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. So here we have an uncorrected raw on the left side. You can see a bit of that pincushion distortion that's there. Again, that can be quite flattering for people's faces, so you may or may not want to correct it. A bit of vignette in the corners. Here you can see an easily manually corrected result on the right. I achieved the corrected result with a -5 to correct for the distortion. You can see it corrects nice and linear. And then there's a +32 to correct for the vignette in the corners. And again, it cleans up very easily. No issue there. Likewise here, you can see that we don't really have a whole lot of longitudinal chromatic aberration either infringing before or after the plane of focused. Nice and clean there. Here's a real-world shot, again, with some high contrast in these little blossoms. You can see, however, that we really have a quite good-looking result and not really any kind of fringing, messing things up. Lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame are also well controlled. You can see in all of these black to white transitions that there's no evidence of fringing around them. So here's a look at the test chart, and we're going to start at f2. This is 61 megapixels, and we're going to view results at 200% magnification. So let's zoom in. You can see in the center of the frame that detail is good. contrast is not off the charts good. There's room for improvement still there. We can see the mid-frame is looking solid, kind of a similar story, but with just a little bit less acuity, a little less fine detail rendering. Overall, however, not bad. Here we can see not a big drop. There is a drop, however, from the left corner of the build down to the bottom right. You can see it just doesn't look as crisp. And then as we move off into the corner, you can just see that surprisingly in the very edge doesn't look too bad. This almost looks softer here than it does here. If we back off even to 100%, however, for a real world shot, we can see a couple of things. First of all, obviously focus is very good here, but you can see that around that very narrow plane of focus, the detail and contrast are really not bad. I think sufficient to where most people would be satisfied. And again, as we're going to detail, the trade-off is that the background is really, really nice and soft. So I think it's a fairly good compromise. Should you want even more contrast, however, stop down a little bit. Actually, even by f2.2, it starts to improve. By f2.8, you can see a fairly significant increase of contrast here. So look how much darker the darks look and then how much brighter the brights look. And so that's going to translate on over into the mid-frame, which you can see looks significantly sharper. The corners are looking sharper, but they haven't hit peak yet. Above all, you're seeing a natural vignette lift and then also more contrast there. We'll take a quick look around the world here, and we can see fairly consistent here on the left side, looking up into the upper left corner. Upper left corner is looking pretty good, and then finally the upper right corner. Overall, I would say a fairly consistent centering result. Now you can see as far as the corners go that if you stop on down to f4, particularly at the very edge, it's looking really good. And overall, we've seen a significant improvement. You can stop on down to f5.6 and f8 for a very, very minor increase. For a real-world example, this is f8, and if we look in at 100% magnification, you can see that we've got very nice detail and also good contrast in the center of the frame. And even as we pan towards this edge at this island here, you can see a lot of resolution and detail there. And then likewise, if we were to jump over to the far right side, you can also see that detail is holding off here towards the edge as well. Now by f11, contrast and detail is still looking very good. You'll see after f11, however, that it will soften somewhat due to the effects of diffraction. And so you can see a pretty significant difference in contrast and detail pop versus this. And so that probably isn't worth doing unless you absolutely have to get down to f16. So as noted, maximum magnification is not particularly good. You can't magnify very high. You can't get particularly close. In the area of focus, however, detail and contrast looks quite good. And so even at f2. And so, I mean, that is the upside here. So as a byproduct, you can't get super close, but you can get close enough to strongly blur out backgrounds. And again, as we've already discussed, the bokeh is really nice and soft from this. This kind of stood out to me because there is quite a bit of hard edges of structures in the background. So we can see the foreground bokeh looks good, and then also the background bokeh looks really nice and soft as well. I also felt like colors actually look quite good from the lens. The optical glass is not really cheap, and so byproduct is you can see color rendition here is nice and rich, not oversaturated. It doesn't look nasty. It just looks good. Another shot here, you can see again that colors look natural, not garish or anything, and the amount of detail and contrast, and then just how all of that translates to the color science looks quite good here. Finally, as noted, flare can be an issue. So here's an example of bad flare. And obviously this big kind of ghosting blob is not helping the image. You can see that wide open, if the sun is more centered in the frame, it's not too bad. I mean, there's a little bit of a veiling, a little bit of kind of an artistic coloration here, but again, it's artistic. Going back to this for a moment, sun being out of frame here, but you can see how it's just more of a distraction than what that is. You stop down to f11 as we've got here. There's a little bit of ghosting pattern, but it's still not bad. How do you like the helicopter that was flying into there? I've got a crew from the church I pastor that pilots one of these helicopters. Anyway, here, however, it looks a lot worse when I just reposition the sun over towards the corner of the frame where we got this big ghosting blob there. So again, you know, here is a good example. This feels very artistic to me. I love the effect, actually. It looks really, really cool. So I like it better wide open than stop down. And here also, not a bad result. It looks, to me, it's very artistic and usable. So you're just gonna have to be careful how you compose, and it's better. I think it's more artistic if you shoot at wide apertures. And so as you can see, a pretty nice little package here, and hopefully that overall resolution examination helps you to understand better whether or not it's a lens for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.